And so the goal of these webinars is to share some of the latest research and extension information about growing specialty mushrooms. We're going to hear from folks that are partners in our project, ongoing mushroom project to support growers of all types and scales. We're going to also have a lot of guest folks come in and share about their enterprises. And this afternoon we have Renee Jacobson, who will share about her farm and the SARE farmer grant that she just completed. And we'll learn some great information, some considerations as we get into mushroom production. All of these webinars are going to be recorded and posted to the Small Farm Program YouTube site. If you have registered for these webinars, you will get a notice of that link when it's posted, when we have the playlist for the recordings. So if you want to revisit or share them, we'd encourage you to do that. And my goal for the first webinar this afternoon is just to overview specialty mushroom production, define that, and look at some of the context of what we're seeing in the US right now, some of the opportunities here for growers to consider. So without further ado, and I'll just note that there's a typo on the first slide there. It is cornellmushrooms.org is the website. So we'll fix that up for next time. But again, this is a project of the Cornell Small Farms Program and CCE Harvest New York. We're both extension programs through Cornell University that work statewide and in New York City to promote a lot of different types of agriculture and to support folks to get into farming. And specialty mushrooms just happens to be one of these avenues that I was fortunate enough to sort of pick up where Professor Ken Mudge left off when he retired. He was doing a lot of research around mushroom production, mostly focused on log-grown shiitake. So really excited to continue this work and bring a number of educational opportunities, a number of resources, and continue to do field research, which I'll talk about a bit in this first segment. So let me give you a full screen view here of the slides. I just want to acknowledge a number of different project partners that are really essential to achieving this project that's going to be ongoing and continuous. We have a number of small businesses that are either producing spawn, selling spawn, doing education, or some mix of those. So you can see some of those on the left side of the screen. We also have three major partners based in New York City that also work quite regionally, Just Food, Grow NYC, and Farm School NYC that we're partnering with to work on this project. And our goal is really from the outset is to see and support folks so that we can expand the specialty mushrooms that are being produced in the US and that they're done in a way that supports folks' livelihood, supports environmental sustainability, and supports opportunity for folks who want to get into agriculture. And we really see, I think everyone in this list here could wax on about the different opportunities in mushrooms, and that everyone's interested in seeing more people get on board, which is a really exciting thing. This is a cooperative community, and there's lots of opportunity here. Mushroom production doesn't need to look any certain way. It doesn't need to be a certain scale. It's really about matching what your goals are, what your audience's goals are if you're an educator, and figuring out how to support them in that. So there's lots of room here, and I'm excited to see where this goes. And I've been excited for the past almost 10 years to be working for Extension and seeing the huge demand and interest and curiosity around mushrooms. So just to reiterate, we'll do these webinars on the first Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. We'll basically do these as two small sessions, roughly 40 minutes in length, and we'll take a break, just a 10-minute break in between to transition. Sometimes those sessions will be a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. I'm going to try to go a little bit shorter today so we give Renee a little more time. If you haven't registered, we do ask that you register at the link on this slide. You can also find this on our cornellmushrooms.org website. Just gives us some information, and then every month that we're doing this, we can send you the link to log into the webinar. So our project is really, like many extension projects, we have a research component, and we have extension or educational component. And so in this latest iteration, what we're really trying to do is expand from a focus on just outdoor forms of mushroom production and really broaden that to all forms of specialty mushroom production, because depending on people's goals and context, there's a lot of different approaches that can be beneficial for those farms, and we don't want to limit it to just one type of production system. So while traditionally we've been focused on much of the outdoor system, we are moving into some of the indoor or controlled environment spaces. And we'll dive into some of those details as we go through this webinar series, but we'll also touch upon some of the outdoor systems. And again, what we see are growers do do one of them. They do outdoor, they do indoor, they do a combination of both. And that really, again, depends on goals and context in this. So we do offer a series of online courses in the off season. We do an outdoor production course in the late fall. End of this year it'll happen, and then in early 2020 we do an online course in indoor mushroom cultivation. So those are 6-week courses, and they fit alongside a whole suite of online courses that the Small Farm Program offers. We do a number of hands-on workshops, some of them here in the Cornell campus, some at partner farms, and some in the city. And I'll make sure you know how to connect to our listserv if you're not on that, and you can find out about those live opportunities as they arise, because we'll announce them. And then we are getting back into production research. So what we're going to be looking at over the next few years is to try to really quantify and develop economic models for indoor production systems. So I'll talk a bit about that, and you can see from our previous work where that's going to really create some value and some support for growers. So we'll dive into that a little bit later in this presentation. On our website, just want to point out a couple things here. If you're not familiar, please do visit. We actually are going through a redo of the website, so that'll be changing up a bit, but hopefully the goal is to make things even easier to find. But for now, if you go to this website, you'll find videos and fact sheets for all the major mushroom production systems that we've worked on over the years. We will be unveiling some new ones with regard to indoor production over the next several months. So most of the ones on there now are more the outdoor systems, but you can look for more updates there. We do have a page about identification. It's really important if you're growing mushrooms, especially if you're selling mushrooms, to be really comfortable with identification. And so that page covers the basics of where to get started and offers some resources to further your learning. We're wrapping up a project that we called Viability. This was focused on log-grown shiitake, so there's some resources on that page. We have a supplier directory, which is twofold. One is suppliers of spawn and equipment and materials needed to cultivate mushrooms. So those are private producers of those products all over the country. And you can find a directory and a listing and links to those folks' websites. It's also a log sourcing directory where folks who are interested in selling or offering logs for sale for mushroom cultivation can link up with folks who are looking to buy logs. So you'll find a map and some information about buying and selling logs on that page. And then finally, we have the network page. This is where you can go and join our listserv. This is an open listserv to anyone interested in mushroom cultivation. And if you click on that and sign up, we'll add you to the list. You can also add yourself manually. The full instructions are on that webpage. And this listserv is something that we use to communicate with everyone interested. But it's also something you can use. If you send a note to that list, if you have a question about cultivation, you have a problem arise in your system, it's a really great forum for folks to communicate and share tips and tricks along the way, so we can get some good dialogue going, support each other as growers. So do check out the website and all those kind of offerings there. And I'll just mention that we're not the only sort of one-stop shop for mushroom resources. There's a number of wonderful folks out there offering really great information. Just a couple examples from some of our partners. Fungi Ally has released a series of small downloadable guides to cultivation of different species of mushrooms. So there's one on oysters, shiitake, and cordyceps that are really great resources. These were products from several USDA-funded projects that Willie and folks in Fungi Ally have worked on. Really recommend checking those out on their website. Another partner of ours in the Midwest, Myers Mushrooms, has a wonderful Vimeo channel that really walks you through building out a production facility in a garage, and then most recently he's expanded and is showing the step-by-step process of building out a mushroom production facility. So you really get a sense of the scale and the equipment and all the kind of troubleshooting that goes into developing these. So I really recommend checking those out if they pique your interest. So good information out there to get you started. Let's get into this a bit. Let's define specialty mushrooms first. This is a term that the USDA has used, and what we basically would call a specialty mushroom is anything that is not Agaricus bisporus. And if you don't know this, Agaricus bisporus is actually a single species of mushroom that we might know commonly as either a button mushroom, a cremini mushroom, or a portabella. Those are actually all the same mushroom species. What's happening is that they're either bred for different coloration, or they're bred or harvested, I should say, at different times. So when that mushroom first pops out of the substrate there, you can see in the picture below, it's a button mushroom. It's tight, doesn't have exposed gills. As that mushroom starts to open up, and if pigment is developed in the cap, then you have your cremini. And if that mushroom is allowed to fully expand, then you have your portabella. So that's just one species, and that's over 95% of what we consume in the US is just one species of mushroom. And I think we can do a bit better than that. And so when we think of specialty mushrooms, we think of things like shiitake up there on the left, or lion's mane. And these are really growing in interest, both because they're beautiful, they're delicious, and they have a lot of medicinal nutritional properties as well. So some information, some data that we pulled as we have been researching and learning about the mushroom industry that's relevant to share with you all. One interesting thing is that, you know, in the late 70s, per capita consumption of mushrooms in the US was considerably low, 0.69 pounds per person. But by, you know, the turn of the 90s into the 2000s, we saw a pretty big jump to about 4 pounds per person per capita. Now that's pretty small compared to a lot of other countries. That's an average across the whole nation. Obviously, some people eat a lot less, some people eat a lot more. I think some weeks during our growing season at our farm, I eat 4 pounds in a week. So, you know, it's an average across our nation, but it's a significant jump that's happened over the last 20 or 30 years. And what's interesting is while we see a huge increase in growth in the sales of specialty mushrooms in the US, we've seen about 5.5% average increase over the past 5 years. This is really only representing about 0.08 pounds per capita. And so there's a big gap there to be filled. So most specialty mushrooms at this point are imported from outside of the US. Great opportunity for us to get involved and produce these domestically. And really this bottleneck is partially because there's just not that many growers out there doing this commercially at whatever scale you want to talk about. So according to USDA, does an annual survey of mushroom growers. So those that reported, there were only 226 in the whole country growing specialty mushrooms. So we definitely need more. There's definitely more than just 226. And I'd encourage you, if you are a grower that's selling mushrooms, to, if you're not getting the annual survey from USDA statistics about mushroom growing, to get on that. And if you are getting it, to report, because we'll get a better representation. But suffice to say, we are certainly lower on the number of producers than we could be. And so there's a great open niche here. And what we see when we look at the larger trend is that over the last 6 years, we've had a massive growth in sales. And this is not average sales, this is like total sales. So there's quite a large jump, and we only anticipate that's going to continue to grow. This has led some folks to really have this conversation and to put out into some of the interesting publications out there that talk about ag development, ag innovation. Where is agriculture headed? This is from one of our partners at Smallhold Mushrooms in New York City. Andrew Carter wrote this article that's entitled "Why 2019 is the Year of the Mushroom." So he gets into this kind of interesting development, this interesting rapid growth that we see in production. And it's a great article that's linked on our cornellmushroom.org website. But some of the reasons that we see such an increase in demand and such an interest, and hopefully we'll see that per capita consumption of mushrooms just continue to expand. So one thing we see is a lot of folks really getting more interested in paying attention to where their food comes from, what it's made from, how it's grown, all these kind of things. And with the kind of expansion of cuisine across the US, we see mushrooms playing a big role in what are seen as more sort of new and exotic foods. But certainly in other cultures, other places of the world, mushrooms have a really consistent and important and central role in foods and cuisine. Folks are getting more and more aware and understand there's incredible health benefits. It was largely seen that mushrooms were sort of a fibrous thing that didn't have a lot of nutrition, but actually the opposite is true. Mushrooms are very high in vitamin D, high in potassium, magnesium, contain all the essential amino acids that we need. I mean, there's an incredible amount of nutrition in these mushrooms and they offer some nutrition that's hard to find in other foods. We see that consumers are looking for interesting alternatives when they look at the impacts of meat consumption, especially in the context of climate change. And so alternatives, mushrooms are a really high protein source with zero saturated fats, and they can be produced quite sustainably. You can see down here, there's this one project called the Blended Burger Project, which encourages chefs to sign on and take their burgers on their menus and replace just 25% of the meat in the burger with mushrooms. And what they say is that the mushrooms actually, the burgers actually taste a lot better when they do that. and you're also reducing the sort of ecological footprint of that burger when you do it. And so there's a nice article and summary of the low ecological footprint, the sustainability that is inherent in mushroom growing. So really low requirements for water and energy, and low CO2 emissions, especially when compared to other production systems. Then finally, one major region, there's a real interest in the culinary world on the umami flavor. This is considered sort of the sixth flavor. Certain aged cheeses like Romanos and Parmesan, seafood and mushrooms really are the only foods that have this. And the umami flavor is said to be a very complex flavor that brings out all the other flavors in whatever you're cooking it with. And so this becomes a real selling point for a lot of folks. And really the freshness and the quality of the mushrooms has a lot to do with that. And so these are just some of the reasons. There's of course other things, but I think mushrooms are a great thing to get into because it's kind of trendy right now, right? And so that's an advantage from a farm production standpoint. I'll talk briefly about some of the differences between outdoor and indoor systems. This is something we get as a question all the time with the Small Farms program, and try to answer as well as we can. We did just publish an article that kind of outlines the major differences between the systems. What should be said from the outset is that mushrooms themselves, the process is very similar in the sense of taking the mushrooms, introducing it to a substrate, providing the appropriate conditions for that to fruit, harvesting, marketing, selling. So the basic process is the same, but there's some major differences when we look at indoor versus outdoor production. So again, this article is linked on the cornellmushroom.org website, as well as if you go to smallfarm.cornell.edu/quarterly, you'll find it in the most recent spring edition of the paper. So let's look at a couple of these differences. And I wouldn't say one is better than the other. The quality of mushrooms that comes out of these systems is really highly dependent on the grower and the conditions they set up and the attention that they pay to their system. It is not that one system produces superior or inferior mushrooms. So what we have here are the species that we mainly can cultivate, and I've bolded and starred the ones that really have sort of commercial viability. And when we say commercial viability, what we mean is we can produce a very consistent, high quality crop. Week after week, we can serve a market and we can be reliable to that market. And so with outdoor, the biggest thing to note is that there's really only one species, the log-grown shiitake, that can arguably be produced in a consistent, reliable manner, albeit it's seasonal during the growing season. But you can produce shiitake and get a pretty good sense of what your yield will be on a weekly basis. You can grow oyster and lion's mane. You can grow stropharia and a form of the agaricus, the almond agaricus. You can grow all those outside, but the yields often ebb and flow. They're not very consistent, and so it's hard to build a business off of them. But we know plenty of growers who build a business just off log-grown shiitake. They inoculate a bunch of these other species, and when they show up, as long as that grower has established themselves a good market, they can usually sell those other species through their existing market channels. But probably none of those other species are going to form the basis of a good farm business, right? When we move indoors, what we see is, all the species that we're growing really become economically viable. That's the big advantage. We start to talk about the ability to grow year-round if we want to, or to extend the season on the shoulders if we want to grow outside of the hot summer months. And that's the main advantage, I would say, of indoor production is really you have a lot of different species in your palette. And what you'll find is if you start out with one and you grow those, your customers, if satisfied, will say, well, what else you got? What else can you grow? And so what we see again are some growers start in outdoor. They might go to indoor. They might do a hybrid system. They might just do their shiitakes outdoors and do other species in some kind of contained environment. There's lots of options within this. But generally speaking, this is what we see as some of the trends. What we like about the outdoors, we can connect the production of those mushrooms to good forest management. And we really don't have a lot of capital or infrastructure investment versus indoor. There's some level of needing to build a space, to maintain that space. And with outdoor, we really rely on the forest, the woods, as the environment appropriate for fruiting mushrooms. When we go indoors, what we're doing is we're controlling that environment. And so we have to provide power and water, heating, cooling, all these kind of things. It's more energy intensive than outdoor production, but it's still quite low compared to many forms of especially controlled environment agriculture. It does require that you consistently monitor all these things and adjust with them and work with them. And with outdoor, we really get to lean on the woods very heavily for those needs. So again, shiitake logs are really what we focus on with commercial outdoor production. And the big reason for this is we can, once these logs have been inoculated and allowed to sit for somewhere between 6 and 12 months, we can soak these logs in water, whether that's a natural body of water like the pond here or a tank of water, and we can force them to fruit. And that's really the key to why they can be so reliably cultivated. And so for most folks interested in outdoor, and are thinking sort of, I want to sell some mushrooms, this is really the go-to. And you can manage these systems, and there's many enterprises that just do shiitake on logs and do perfectly well, or supplement with some of those more, those species that ebb and flow a bit more. When we move indoors, oysters are often the one that folks start with. And again, there's farms that just grow oysters, or there's farms that do logs outside and grow oysters in a high tunnel, in a hoop house, in a corner of a basement. There's all sorts of ways we can adapt space, which we'll get into in some of the future webinars. But oysters are one of the easiest to start growing indoors. They grow very fast through the material. They fruit very reliably, and they are very adaptable to a lot of different conditions. So these we would say is the gateway to the other mushrooms. If you want to learn how to grow shiitake or lion's mane or reishi or some of the other mushrooms indoors, we really often recommend you start with oyster because of its consistency and because of the success you can achieve in a relative short order. Oysters are most commonly done on straw that is treated before inoculation. So the pictures on the left there are straw packed into buckets that can be reused. Another common system is to pack them into tubes, plastic tubes, like you can see, and hang those from the space. And then the other common one is what we would call supplemented sawdust. So we take sawdust, we clean that, we add some kind of supplement to it for nutrition, something higher in nitrogen than sawdust. And the sawdust blocks tend to yield a bit higher than a straw because there's a bit more nutrition. There's also a bit more sterilization required in that process of treatment. So this is really what we see most folks starting with, and then they may stick with just oyster. They might branch out from the blues and the grays and the whites to some of the more exotic oysters like the yellow ones you see there or the pinks. And then sometimes growers also go further and develop markets for different species that can grow in the same space or adjacent space in their indoor system. So there's lots of other species you can then go from. Some of the ones we see really getting popular are the lion's mane, both for its culinary delight, which is really similar to scallops or seafood, but also for its medicinal value. So it's really linked to a lot of aspects of repairing nerve damage, with cognitive function, with memory, and supporting illnesses like Alzheimer's, MS, that sort of thing. Chestnut mushrooms are becoming really popular one, and really popular with chefs in particular. And then some of the more advanced ones like the king trumpet mushrooms here on the bottom right, we see growers getting into, again, a bit more in advance. These mushrooms require a bit more precision, some more specifics in terms of their cultivation, but they're natural extensions once you've gotten into the indoor production systems. So just a little bit on profit potential. We did this work with shiitake. We did this work at Cornell, Cornell's research forest, as well as in partnership with about 25 shiitake growers around the Northeast US. So we had them inoculate 100 logs and keep 2 to 3 years of data. And what was great about that was we were able to then really average out what the cost of production was, what the potential yields were, how much labor this would be in, and we could really start to estimate what this enterprise could look like. So for outdoor shiitake alone, we could broken down the costs here per log. So roughly just over $1 in materials, and then about $12, $13 in labor to actually take care of that log over its lifetime. And then what we find for yields is every time you soak a log, you get on average 1/4 to 1/2 pound of shiitakes. And you get about 8 flushes out of the log, and you get about 4 pounds total over its entire lifetime. And that's usually over about 3 to 4 seasons of production. And if you consult our resources, you'll learn that if you're not familiar with log-grown shiitake, they're soaked in a cycle. After they've fruited, they have to rest, and then you can soak them again. So you can't just continuously produce off the same log. It requires a bit of a management strategy that's relatively easy to achieve. So we were able to break down all these kind of elements, assign labor values to them. We have enterprise budget spreadsheets where you can plug in the number of logs that you want to work with, and you can get a sense of the productivity of those depending on where you sell them. So, we summarize below there that a business would cost, $4,700 to establish, and would continuously yield just over 1,000 pounds of mushrooms, which should gross around $12,500, depending on the price again. And so this was work that was done from 2010 to 2013. Cornell University, along with the University of Vermont, Chatham, and then those wonderful growers who were willing to collect and share their data, which is really critical to this project. So we have a really good sense with shiitake. Now we compare that to indoor systems. This is really what we're getting into now. You'll see a lot of question marks on this one, right? So we're looking to calculate and figure out costs for growers to inoculate and manage these systems for maybe per rack or per square foot, in terms of in a similar way that we've done it with shiitake per log. What's interesting with indoor production is you can achieve a very high what's called biological efficiency, which is essentially a term for how much dry material, or wet material I should say, substrate you can convert into fresh mushrooms. And so that really ranges on a lot of different variables. You can have very low biological efficiency or very high. And often new growers achieve lower productivities, and they can get much higher as they optimize their system. So that really depends. We're hoping to dial in on that a bit more as we get into our production research. And then as we look at labor, there's a lot of questions here. We have some general summaries from growers, but some of the projects we're involved with that we're going to continue to work with, some will engage growers and some will be on-site research here at Cornell. So we're hoping in the next few years to be able to provide more and more accurate numbers, and those numbers can then inform more and more accurate enterprise budgets. So a lot of growers that get into it now, they do the math, they realize there's a good price point on these, and they go for it. But we'd like to be able to provide something a little more detailed as we get through the process here. So what we hear from growers is somewhere between a $1 to $3 of income per square foot, and somewhere between 50 cents and $1.50 costs is generally a rule of thumb. But it all depends. There's so many variables as we're diving into this to consider. So look forward to us getting and drilling down a bit more into this and getting some more accurate numbers for you, and develop some budget tools for this type of system as well. And one of the big factors in income is really about pricing. What we really see with mushrooms, like a lot of kind of niche specialty crops, is there's high variability in the pricing. That really depends on your locality, and what the demand is and what the perception of mushrooms are. So if mushrooms are seen as essentially a vegetable, then you're going to get pretty low prices. If they're seen as on par with a high quality dairy product or protein or meat product, then you're going to get a higher price per pound. So marketing becomes as critical as the technical side of production. And what we see most growers getting into initially is often selling at sort of common direct markets, farmers markets, maybe a CSA, some other type of farm stand or something like that. And then often restaurants are a really good one, because some restaurants are willing to pay a premium. Some growers are then expanding to the point where they really reach those larger wholesale markets. As your market, as your buyer takes more pounds, you're going to essentially go down in price. And so there's a lot of nuance to this. There's a lot of consideration here. This graph is from our log-grown shiitake research back in 2011. The black bar there shows the range in prices that we were getting, our growers were getting, I should say. And the gray bar represents the average. So for farmers market, everyone was, there's a range from 11 to close to 19 or $20 a pound. And then the average was right in the middle there, 15. So this is important. And obviously as a grower, it's important to try to fetch as high a price as possible, but to really do some upfront understanding of your market and what the potential is. And this is really this has big implications for the production systems that you're actually looking at. And Chatham University and Alan Matthews have done some great surveys to really look at this vast range in pricing, which is just something that often happens with a crop that's in high demand and it doesn't have a ton of supply. This is a whole bunch of other interesting research summaries here. Just some things to note. There's a study in 2000 that really focused on quality, freshness, and price as being really critical features in good shiitake sales in this case. But really in general, that's really where you're going to differentiate yourself from the larger distributors, is offering a really fresh and high quality product. So oyster mushrooms, coming from a larger distributor, very often aren't in a full floret of oysters. They're often kind of beat up, and so if you can offer something that's of a superior quality, you can often get a better price. We see the interest there is from North Carolina. That study showed that a lot of folks are interested in producing local mushrooms, and a lot of folks see the growth happening. That was back in 2002, but still very relevant today. 2011, we found that 90% of the growers we were working with found that the demand in their area consistently exceeded the supply, and so there was good opportunity. I think that still really holds. And in 2015, Chatham again did a survey and found that there was a real deficiency in what growers perceived that the market needed versus what was able to be supplied. So only supplying about 30% of the demand right now. So some examples, and to emphasize that we talk about markets on a national level, but there's also a lot of influences on the local level that are going to play out in terms of how your sales go and how your prices go. So last slide for me, and then I'll answer some questions, and we'll take a short break to transition to Renee's presentation. I just want to really emphasize that there's room here in this market for a lot of different scales. We're really curious to hear from folks, learn about what types of production they're interested in, what scale they're interested in. There's no right or wrong size to be in this field of production. Or in this room, I should say, because it's not really field production. But some things we've seen, some people might want to grow 10 pounds a week for a little bit of side income, or a farm stand that just brings in a little money, or for a community project, that sort of thing. We see farms that have multiple enterprises. They might have a goal of 50 pounds a week, or we might see someone that really wants to make a partial living or a full living, and they might do 500 pounds or something like that a week, right? So there's a lot of different scales, a lot of different contexts. And we hope to hear from folks about what they're interested in, and we certainly want to support folks at every single scale of their operation here. Great. So with that, I will see if there's any questions. It is about 3:35 right now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording, and if you want to